Please be seated.
Thanks. This may be bad news for the interpreters, but I do need to speed up a little bit. I'm going to move quickly on over a couple of topics I was going to cover to that event, and directly to the area which may cause me to be accused of unmitigated arrogance. I'm going to deal with the question of the meeting at the Bratenatz Brigade. This is dealt with extensively in both our brief and the prosecution's final brief, but just a few points, please. Firstly, Trivic's diary and his evidence are not independent evidential sources. They stand and fall together. And if you needed a transcript reference for that, it would be T11978, where Trivic himself concedes that point. There are, we submit, a number of compelling reasons as to why Trivic's recollection and recording of a meeting on the 12th of July simply cannot be right. There are 7. Firstly, according to his recollection, there were no prisoners in the centre of Bratenatz on the evening that he attended a meeting. Secondly, there was no information at the meeting he attended about the whereabouts of the 28th Division. Thirdly, that on the afternoon or late evening of the 11th of July, General Mladic, as we saw on the video, had been exhorting all his officers, Trivic included, to go to Bratenatz that evening. It only makes sense that they would. Fourthly, there were no buses in Popović when Trivic passed through it on the evening he went to the meeting. Only people. That can only have been the 11th, not the 12th. Fifthly, during the meeting, Mladic received a telephone call which Trivic overheard relating to the provision of fuel for buses. This is directly sequential to the conversation Mladic had had with Karamans at the first Hotel Fontana meeting about the provision of transport and fuel for the evacuation. No such conversation could have taken place on the 12th of July. Sixthly, Trivic's evidence was that the conversation he overheard was Mladic arranging the commencement of transportation from Popović the following day. That's at T11980 to 981. That night, he saw no buses in Popović. And seventhly, Trivic said in evidence that he passed through Popović again on the day after the meeting he had attended in the afternoon, and he then saw large crowds of people being loaded onto buses. The evidence from Dutch Bat officers is that the evacuation was completed by about 5 p.m. on the afternoon of the 13th. Accordingly, there could have been no large crowds there on that afternoon for him to see. The diary itself, we submit, is ambiguous as to the date. And for the second time, and possibly the last time, I'm going to call a document into e-court. It's already on the screen. And in particular, the passage relied upon by the prosecution in its final brief needs your attention. It reads, by 8 o'clock tomorrow, General Kostic, that must be Krstić, must prepare a decision for the liberation of Žepa, and continues further down, in the morning of the 13th of July at 10 o'clock, General Mladić will personally address the soldiers in the Viagor sector at the line reached. What is significant about this record is firstly that Trivić has recorded an order by Mladić to Krstić to produce not an order but a decision by 8 o'clock the following morning. The prosecution have conveniently overlooked that fact in linking this diary entry to the production of the order for combat produced by Krstić on the 13th of July. However, the more logical link between what is written here and subsequent events is that Krstić arrived at a decision by 8 o'clock on the 12th and then went to the Bojna repeater at 9 o'clock, where he met the commanders and announced his decision to sweep the terrain towards Viagor prior to the action towards Žepa commencing. Secondly, and we submit significantly, why Trivić would have recorded in the very next entry that Mladić would address the soldiers at 10 o'clock on the 13th of July rather than tomorrow makes no sense. The use of the phrase the 13th of July in that entry plainly implies that the following day was not the 13th of July. Most of the other evidence touching on this meeting has been substantially reviewed in the briefs, and I'm not going to go over it again. However, two additional pieces which require I submit your attention. Firstly, the evidence of Miodrag Dragutinović. His evidence, we submit, is doubly relevant because he said not only that Pandurović told him on the 12th that the meeting had been on the previous evening, but also that critically at 5 o'clock in the afternoon of the 12th, when Krstić, as we know, went to Viagor to meet the commanders, Krstić told him that Mladić would come the following day to address the troops. Krstić could not have known that if Mladić only said that at a meeting 5 hours after he spoke to Miodrag Dragutinović. Therefore, Krstić must have known that from a meeting which took place the previous evening. I know it's been a very long trial, but you might remember Miodrag Dragutinović, the operations officer from the Zvornik Brigade, a chartered surveyor by profession, a small, measured and quiet man who probably gave some of the most reliable and credible evidence that the trial chambers heard in 3 years in our submission. He was called as a prosecution witness. They didn't have to call him, but they did. And to suggest now, again, without any contradiction of his account during re-examination, which was then permissible, that he is lying, we submit is inappropriate and incorrect. He had been the subject of a 146-page interview. They knew what he was going to say, and he was not challenged about it and was called as a witness of truth. His re-examination went on for several hours and was even adjourned overnight. Again, no suggestion made that he was anything less than honest or accurate about the date he recalled being told by Popović a meeting had taken place the night before, and by Krstić that Mladić would come the following day. The second point really arises directly from that, which is, I think we all agree that on the early evening of the 12th of July, Krstić did go to Viagor, and he did speak to all of the brigade commanders who were going to go on to Žepa. That, in our submission, makes a nonsense of the idea that all of those people then went from Viagor back to Bratunac later that evening to discuss, doubtless, precisely the same thing. Now, there has been a lot of discussion about the date of the meeting, but almost none about its content. The prosecution's approach seems to be that proof of the date is sufficient, and the rest can simply be inferred. Whatever was the date of the meeting, it is actually instructive to look at who was not there. Biara wasn't there, Popović wasn't there, Kosaric wasn't there, Tolomir wasn't there, Momir Nikolic was nearby but he wasn't in the meeting, Vasic was not there. Nobody from MUP was there. And who was at Potočari? Well, most, if not all, of the above. In our submission, the meetings which can be proven to have taken place at around this time indicate clearly where the division of function lay between the soldiers and those concerned with prisoners. The people at this meeting were the military men whose responsibility it would be to defeat the ABIH at Žepa, i.e. to fight. These were not the men whose concern under the combat order or generally was the taking or detention of prisoners or the movement of civilians. The prosecution say, why would Mladić conceal these things from his military commanders? We say the counter-argument is, why would he tell them? He had mobilized and ordered the relevant people and resources to deal with Potočari, and he didn't need his military commanders to do anything or know about it. The evidence as to separate meetings with security men in this case is a bit vague, but those people didn't all appear in Potočari by magic. So there must have been separate meetings, and it must have been before the busing of the population at Potočari began. It's illogical to infer that the same matters needed further discussion with people who were about to be dispatched to fight in Žepa. Quite simply, the argument doesn't work. They did not need to know. Leaving aside the physical circumstances, which of course would suggest that Trivić is wrong, the prosecution's assertion about what the commanders must have known by the 12th of July are based exclusively on the evidence of Momir Nikolic, which the prosecution itself has conceded cannot be relied upon where not corroborated by other reliable evidence. Paragraph 502. His assertions, moreover, as to what he told Blagojevich are completely without corroboration. Accordingly, the trial chamber should, on the prosecution's own invitation, regard its submissions about what Popović must have known, even if he had attended a meeting on the 12th of July. Lastly, a submission which I've briefly touched upon, the position of Trivich himself. Not said to be part of a joint criminal enterprise, not necessary to give him a warning under Rule 90 before he gives evidence. It is now suggested in the brief that he not only took part in a meeting at which forcible transfer and murder was discussed, in spite of his denials, but moreover that he has committed perjury on that subject. We say to make that suggestion at this stage is outrageous. I'm going to move on now to the sections of the prosecution brief which deal with my client's alleged knowledge of the murder operation. And I'm going to start with the 13th of July. Firstly and foremostly, there is no doubt or dispute that between the 12th and 13th of July, Pandurović was moving from Viogor towards Vlasenica. You might recall that on the late evening of the 13th of July, we find him refueling his car in a convoy at a petrol station in Vlasenica. He did not encounter any Muslim forces. Nobody suggests that he did. There were no Muslim forces in the area through which he was passing, though thus there is no question of him being aware in his immediate vicinity of the taking of any prisoners. There's no evidence of any communication between him and anybody in Bratunats, and there's absolutely no reason why he should have got in touch with anybody in Bratunats. The prosecution's submission that the movement of prisoners from Bratunats to Zvornik was due to the presence of NGOs and international agencies is completely false. There is no evidence that that was the motivation for moving the prisoners. Derenich's evidence is that the prisoners were moved quite simply because he demanded it. In fact, the murders at Kravica, just outside Bratunats on the main road, Srska and the Yada Valley, if the prosecution's theory is believed, completely destroy the notion that anybody was worried about outside agencies. If further confirmation were needed that the theory is nonsense, even after the decision of Karadzic and Derenich to move the prisoners to Zvornik, Biara was still looking for places to murder them in Bratunats on the morning of the 14th, so he plainly didn't care who might see him doing it. The prosecution theory that the decision to murder all the men was taken sometime on the 12th depends entirely on the evidence we submit of Momir Nikolic. Again, the prosecution say of him, where his evidence is not corroborated, you should not rely upon it. We say that that is not correct, and the evidence does not support any such finding, and the matter is dealt with fully in our brief. It is correct that Mladic addressed the troops on the morning of the 13th of July, and that Krstić was there with him. But there is no evidence that he talked to Pandurović, or anybody else for that matter, about the plan to murder prisoners at that stage. And the trial chamber has heard not only from Pandurović, but also Trivich and Dragutinović, and no suggestion was made to them that any such information was passed. At that stage, the morning of the 13th of July, the decision to move prisoners to Zvornik had not been taken. So there was no need to make Pandurović a unique recipient of such information. The idea that Mladic would share all his plans and the activities of his chief of security with a load of brigade commanders involved in combat is ridiculous and not supported by any evidence. The decision to move the prisoners from Bratunats to Zvornik was taken at a high political level, and it was taken swiftly. The prosecution's concession at paragraph 1392 That it is unclear whether Pandurović knew that the prisoners were to be moved to Zvornik can only be read as an admission that there isn't sufficient evidence to find that he did. All the evidence would suggest we submit a number of things. Firstly, that the decision to move the prisoners was taken at about 8:30 on the evening of the 13th of July. Secondly, that within a very short time, Drago Nikolić was informed, probably by a call from Popović, though the prosecution's position on that is far from clear. Thirdly, that Beara didn't want to move the prisoners, and that even the following day he was trying to find a way to kill them in Brasinac. And fourthly, while all this was going on, Vinko Pandurović was marching towards Žepa. There is no evidence that anybody contacted Pandurović, and why would they? Firstly, if the Zvornik brigade commander needed to be warned to get ready for some prisoners, the person to tell was Obrenović, who was in command of the Zvornik brigade on the 13th of July. Telling Pandurović, who was on a completely different mission, marching towards Žepa, was out of radio communication with the brigade, would be practically useless. Secondly, the last thing Beara wanted was another municipality telling him he couldn't kill his prisoners there. He wanted this over and done with quickly and efficiently. Accordingly, the evidence that Pandurović knew depends exclusively upon PW168's assertion that Drago Nikolić told him that Pandurović knew. That would necessarily depend on some contact being made with Pandurović on the march between the time when the decision to move prisoners was taken in Deronic's office and the time when Drago Nikolić was called. But neither Deronic nor Beara had the means to contact Pandurović from the SDS office, and Momir Nikolić for sure did not do so. Even from the Brasinac Brigade command, there is no evidence that Pandurović was even contactable whilst on the march. It is significant throughout these days that going over to the 14th. There is no evidence even that Krstić knew by the 14th of July that prisoners had been taken to Zvornik. And there is no reason that he should have been told. Because even adopting the regular chain of command, Beara had no duty to report to Krstić. Deronic had no military duty at all, and certainly none to report to Krstić. And Momir Nikolić had no duty to report to Krstić. As I've already said, we submit that the prosecution's warning as to the testimony of Momir Nikolić means that you cannot even find that he informed his own commander, because he's the only source of evidence for that. So on the 14th in the morning at Krivace, Krstić could not even have told Pandurović about the movement of prisoners to Zvornik. Moreover, there is no evidence that anything about prisoners was said at that meeting on the morning of the 14th. Again, Pandurović gave evidence about that, as did Trivic, Jevgevic, Dragutinovic. All were at Kravache on the morning of the 14th, at the time the combat orders for Stučanice 95 were given out, and no suggestion was put to any of them that prisoners were discussed. We submit it cannot be inferred, contrary to the direct evidence of Pandurović and these other four witnesses, that the prosecution's case is correct and that information about prisoners was passed that morning. Assuming the contrary, however, and that Krstić was aware by the morning of the 14th that prisoners had been moved to Zvornik, and that he did inform Vinko Pandurović of that, what is therefore remarkable is that at that time there is no communication between Pandurović and the Zvornik Brigade. Of that we can be absolutely sure, because if there had been, PW 168 would for sure have told you. The duty operations officer's notebook would have recorded it, and there would probably be an incept. That would surely have been the time to get in touch with his command if he had been told about the arrival of the prisoners. It's simply inconceivable that if he had been told by Krstić on the morning of the 14th of July about the movement of the prisoners, that he would, about the movement of the prisoners to Zvornik, that one, that he would not know about the column, two, he would not have contacted the brigade, and three, he would have taken up his positions in Dnieper as if nothing had happened. Again, at paragraph 1392, the assertion that by that time the murder operation was clear to everyone derives solely from the evidence of Momir Nikolic and on the prosecution's own invitation should be disregarded. Let's move forward to the morning of the 15th, please. The prosecution claims at paragraphs 1270, 1393 to 1398 that Pandurović had to know or needed to know about the murder operation in order to fight the Muslim column effectively, and Krstić simply must have informed him about this before his return on the 15th of July. We have a very great number of submissions to make about this, indeed 13. Firstly, nobody suggests that the danger which the column represented to Zvornik was known before the evening of the 14th of July. The prosecution do not even suggest that. Even at the morning of the 14th, Krstić would have talked to Pandurović about the column or its dangers. So what other operations were going on in Zvornik which Krstić may but probably didn't know about had no impact. Secondly, the murder operation was a main staff security operation being carried out by security officers and military policemen from the main staff, the Drina Corps and the Brasinac Brigade. There is no reason a brigade commander should be told about it. Thirdly, as we have demonstrated, there is no such thing as a brigade zone of responsibility. Sixthly, if Abramovich thought that the resources being used to guard prisoners were compromising the brigade's combat capability, he would have said so in his report on the 14th of July, or at least during his conversation with Yevgevich the night previous. Seventhly, as to the Zvornik Brigade resources and the allegation in paragraph 1397 of the prosecution brief that significant numbers of Zvornik Brigade resources were being used up, the amount of resources committed to guarding prisoners and digging graves peaked at 50 on the 14th of July. During the course of the next few days, it dwindled. The Zvornik Brigade had 5,500 men at its disposal. 50 is less than 1% of the brigade's manpower. We ready? Not every battalion was engaged in active combat on the 14th, 15th or 16th of July. And you had the opportunity to see the quality of some of the men who gave evidence in this case. And I mean them no disrespect, but for example, those from the 1st Battalion who came to speak to you and told you about standing guard unarmed in the vicinity of their local school. Do you seriously think that their absence from the front line made any difference to the Zvornik Brigade's fighting capability? Eighthly, the telegrams from Abramovich and the other sources which were available to Krstić and Pandurović on the morning of the 15th of July made no reference to the killing operation. Ninthly, the intercepted telecommunications on the morning of the 15th of July between Pandurović and the brigade command would negate any suggestion that Pandurović had just been informed of the killing operation in Zvornik. It is inconceivable, we say, if Krstić had just told him that there were all sorts of problems arising from the killing operation occurring in Zvornik, and that resources were having to be committed to it from the brigade, that Pandurović would not have asked about it, even in cryptic terms, when he called Mijatović and Milosevic on the morning of the 15th. If, as the prosecution say, he needed to know from Krstić, he so much more needed to know from Zvornik Brigade members what was going on the ground. And a commander like Pandurović would for sure have inquired about that issue if he knew there was an issue. Tenthly, Dragan Jokic, according to the prosecution's submission the other day, is a weak man. I don't know about that, but one thing I do know is he's a very careless user of the airwaves. You need look no further than his intercept with Colonel Biara on the evening of the 14th of July at 21:02, 1164, or his conversation at 9:39 with Bratinat's brigade command at 9:39, P1176, where he was effectively told to shut up rather than give away the whereabouts of his commander on the air. But when Dragan Jokic spoke to Pandurović on that morning about whether there were any problems, he said nothing. Now, that may well mean that I'm making a point in Colonel Biara's favour, because that may well mean that when he referred to problems the night previously to Colonel Biara, over the radio waves, he was in fact referring to the column and nothing else. But for sure, having his commander on the line, it is a stark surprise that he, Dragan Jokic, doesn't say anything which Vinko Pandurović couldn't have prevented him from saying. 11. We all know now that we can add up the men and machinery that in fact were involved in Rahovats and Petkovci. But nobody knew then, and certainly nobody had knowledge then of the sort of numbers that the prosecution now allege were involved. 12thly, if Krstić told Pandurović about the killing operation and the involvement of the Zvornik Brigade in the morning, why didn't Krstić then tell Biara when he called him at 10 o'clock that morning, a few minutes later? Biara was complaining that he had problems. Surely logic dictates, if Pandurović was in the loop of knowledge, that Krstić would say to Biara, Pandurović is on his way back, knows about everything. Why don't you take a few of his men? Hey, perhaps from the 3rd Battalion. They're not involved in combat. If Pandurović had been part of or knowledgeable of the killing operation and knew about the involvement of the Zvornik Brigade, there is no way Biara would not have asked for resources from the Zvornik Brigade for executions in the Zvornik area. There is no way that Krstić wouldn't have told him Pandurović was returning. The only reason that Biara did not seek help from Pandurović was that Pandurović was not part of the plan. This intercept is perhaps as critical as the combat report of later the same day in understanding the evidence that there is and there is not against Vinko Pandurović. We say it is the clearest illustration that at that point in time, nobody could possibly infer that he had any knowledge that the operation was going on. 13th and last, if Krstić spoke to Pandurović on the morning of the 15th about the fact that the killing operation had been moved to Zvornik, why would Pandurović 10 hours later write him a report telling him about the prisoners in the schools? That would effectively be Pandurović writing to Krstić to say, hey, Curly, you know those prisoners you told me about this morning and the problems we've got with them? You're absolutely right, we have. We submit that the whole prosecution theory about what Pandurović would have needed to know and therefore must have known from his meeting with Krstić that morning is utterly false and is based upon inferences that you cannot possibly draw when you look at the evidence in the round. We do add, yet again, that this is a case where the direct testimony in the case from Jevđević and Vinko Pandurović, as well as the hearsay evidence of Mio Dragutinović, completely rules out any such transfer of information at that stage. Now, one of the great mysteries of the case, if you accept Pandurović might be right, as to how he came progressively to know about the executions in Zvornik, may be why Dragan Obrenović did not tell him sooner. It is a perfectly valid question. They had been colleagues for 2.5 years and worked closely together. They had mutual respect for each other. You would expect Obrenović to tell Pandurović at the first available opportunity. So why didn't he? Well, let us not lose sight where the burden of proof lies on all this. This, perhaps more than any other episode in the case against Pandurović, is one where I have to remind you that it's for the prosecution to prove beyond reasonable doubt that he did, and we'd submit in any event that PW168's uncorroborated evidence alone on this topic does not discharge that burden. The history and the impossibility of PW168's corridor story and conversation is dealt with extensively in our brief as well in the brief for Drago Nikolic. In reality, the prosecution is left with nothing else to hold their case together on this topic than to cling desperately to the notion that Pandurović had to know about the security threat and that Obrenović had no reason to conceal this from his commander. But let's analyse it. The following are a series of operating factors upon Obrenović which may act exclusively of each other or in certain circumstances in combination. Firstly, if PW168's evidence about Obrenović's conversation with Drago Nikolic is true, then Obrenović would have believed that Pandurović was already fully informed, and accordingly he had no need to know, least of all in front of an assortment of policemen he had never met before. Secondly, conversely, it is possible that he had nothing to tell. The precise details of Obrenović's state of knowledge of the murder operation and who was involved in it by the 15th of July at about midday is almost impossible to be sure about. At the bottom end, he might have known no more than that Drago Nikolic wanted to be relieved from the EKM and needed 5 military policemen to secure some schools. At the other extreme, he might have been fully aware of the murder and burial of prisoners at Orahovac and Petkovci. The truth is almost impossible to work out, as even the prosecution concede. Accordingly, what in fact he knew at noon on the 15th of July, if not very much, he may not have thought worth telling Pandurović about, given the urgency of the military situation. In any event, he may not have had the opportunity. Even in his 2001 interviews, Obrenović made a point of saying that he wanted to report to Pandurović. At that time, of course, he was asserting only about the military situation, but that he didn't get a proper opportunity. Pandurović simply came into the office on the 15th of July. Obrenović briefed Pandurović for 15 minutes, and then Obrenović was sent off to his task. This version of how the meeting on the 15th of July was conducted, whatever the state of Obrenović's knowledge, is remarkably consistent with all the evidence we now have available. And why would he have lied about that in 2001? Fourthly, he may have been afraid to tell Pandurović what he had done, or at least have wanted the possibility of time to think how best to explain himself. Obrenović was in the command of the Zvornik Brigade on the 13th and the 14th of July. He made the decision to relieve Drago Nikolic of his post as duty officer and provide him with 5 military policemen. He authorised the use of 2 excavator operators for burials at Orahovac. Obrenović may have been more seriously involved than that. We just don't know. He very well may have feared that Pandurović would disprove his actions, whatever they may have been, and criticise them. Fifthly, whilst Obrenović told Pandurović of the conversation with Drago Nikolic, he did not do so on any version of events until more than 24 hours after Pandurovic's return. This is curious. There of course remains the further possibility that the conversation was made up by Obrenović in the first place, but more importantly, that shows that there must have been a second conversation between Pandurović and Obrenović, where Obrenović revealed the genesis of his information, i.e. the number of prisoners, the involvement of Zvornik Brigade, machinery, whose orders they were following, etc. And it may well be, as I've already said, a combination of all those 5 reasons. The fact of the matter is, you simply cannot infer that the conversation did take place because there is no sensible explanation as to why it wouldn't. We suggest there are several explanations as to why it wouldn't, and we've listed them there for you. In truth, to approach it in that way, as Mr. Joss was addressing you about at length on Friday, is a classic case of reversing the burden of proof. It is for the prosecution to persuade you that PW 168's evidence is truthful and reliable, and not for Pandurović to persuade you to the contrary. He merely has to cause a doubt to be cast on that evidence. Given that the prosecution, as we will submit in due course, have abandoned as truthful several important areas of PW 168's evidence, 2 of the most important examples being Pandurović's presence in the Zvornik Brigade on the 12th of July and the meeting with Popović we submit on the 16th of July, it is the defence submission that you cannot rely upon his evidence as credible or reliable in this respect. I'm going to turn now, as quickly as I may, to the irregular combat report of the 15th of July. In brief, we submit that the prosecution's analysis of this document is neither objective nor logical. The prosecution's case as to the meaning of this document is circular. The argument goes, the report itself is evidence of his knowledge, and because of his knowledge, you can therefore interpret the document adversely to him. The interpretation, we say, is based upon a number of false assumptions. The first is that enormous or tremendous resources of the Zvornik Brigade were engaged in dealing with prisoners. They were not. That is simply false. 30, 40 or 50 men was a drop in the ocean and wouldn't have made any difference to anything. Secondly, that Pandurović knew that the murder operation was in progress, that prisoners were awaiting executions, and that Zvornik Brigade resources were involved in these operations. There's no evidence that he did, and it all depends on who told him. If he is, or might be right, that the only information he had prior to writing the report came from Brano Grujic and Lubo Bojanović, then he had and could not have had the information that executions were taking place and that the Zvornik Brigade was involved. Thirdly, that the situation on the ground was accurately reported in the first 5 paragraphs. It wasn't. The best example, perhaps, is that the report suggests that the numbers of the column, I'm very sorry, I'll start that again. The situation on the ground was not accurately reported in the first 5 paragraphs of the report. Evidence suggests that the numbers of the column which eventually did walk to safety were far higher than those mentioned by Pandurović in the report. And fourthly, and perhaps most significantly, that by the time he wrote the report, Pandurović's position was that he would allow the Muslim civilians to go free, but not the soldiers. In truth, by the evening of the 15th of July, the only sticking point was whether they could take their arms with them or not. This is doubly significant. Firstly, because it completely negates the prosecution's baseless suggestion at paragraph 1443 of its brief that Pandurović was fully ready to destroy the army. And secondly, it adds real significance to paragraph 6 of the report, the one that reads, "I have made an offer to the commander of the opposite side," etc. This paragraph foreshadows the report on the 16th of July, in which Pandurović said it was possible that some soldiers got out with the civilians. The obvious inference is, if he had already decided they could all go by the time he wrote this report, then that is what he was referring to when he said, "let them go." And it has a direct correlation with its report of the following day. A few further observations on the report. The assertion of the prosecution made in paragraph 1449 quite simply should be disregarded and cast to one side. Pursuant to the practice, as pointed out to Mr. McCloskey when he was putting to General Pandurović the opinion of Mr. Radinović in another trial, then unless adopted by him, none of that has the force of evidence. Mr. Radinović's opinions in the Kirstich case, whether read into the record of this case or not, simply should not have found their way into arguments in the prosecution brief. None of what he says has the force of evidence, particularly when denied and disagreed with by Vinko Pandurović. In relation to paragraph 1445, the suggestion that the additional burden is not based on any knowledge of Pandurović about trouble in the areas, we say only this. He had been the Zvornik Brigade commander for 2.5 years. He was very well acquainted with the way in which battalion soldiers would react, and in particular, what was likely to make them desert their posts or refuse to go to the lines. There is a stack of evidence from Pandurović, PW168 and Dragatinovich about the occasions when this happened during the course of the preceding 3 years, and Pandurović would know what the incipient dangers of prisoners in schools near to prisoners' homes were. He didn't have to have direct knowledge of any particular complaints. The reliability of Eileen Gillies's note as a piece of evidence was specifically dealt with in our brief, and very little more needs to be said. In reality, the prosecution want to accord the Gillies note with the status of a suspect interview, and we submit it cannot be regarded as such. In virtually all jurisdictions in the latter half of the 20th century to date, it was recognised through advances in technology and the rights of the accused, we needed to protect people in interview situations so that courts could be sure that anything said in an interview situation was both accurately recorded and related to answers given in a satisfactory situation. Voluntariness, I suppose, is the key to it all. The Gillies note fails on all counts. No suspect should be interviewed in these circumstances, and no record of this sort ought to be used to contradict him as to the detail of what might have been said. We are absolutely sure that Miss Gillies, in creating this note, did not envisage that it would end up being used for purposes other than that for which she intended it, namely to provide a brief note on the gist of her lengthy conversation with General Pandurović. The prosecution have simply not grasped the point which Pandurović made about pigs when he gave evidence. What Pandurović was saying was that Richard Butler was interpreting the word asinatia far too narrowly by merely translating it as burying the bodies. Therefore, Pandurović used the example of pigs to show that the word means more than that. He was not saying that the reference to asinatia in the irregular combat report of the 15th of July was a reference to the pigs of the 16th of July or the pigs of 1992. He was saying that on those occasions when that happened, the clear-up of the mess was asinatia. In many ways, the passage relied upon in the note displays the danger of using it as a verbatim record of the conversation. According to Ms. Galice's note, they were talking about a report from 1992 involving the 4th Battalion. Pandurović's immediate explanation, not ultimate, that the discussion covered both the 1992 and 1995 pigs makes perfect sense of the record and cannot simply be dismissed. In relation to the note concerning the information he received from the Chief of Staff about the presence of prisoners in Zvornik on the 15th of July, two mistakes are equally possible. Firstly, that the translation of the position of the man who informed him is inaccurate, or secondly, that the date is wrong. Significantly, Ms. Galice records nothing in her note as having happened on the 16th of July, which is inconceivable because it was the 16th of July that he let the column go at Balkovica. Where she got it wrong, we don't know, but get it wrong, she did. It is correct to say that in paragraph 1456 of its final brief, the prosecution identifies 6 areas where Eileen Ganice's report records events accurately. But what should not be forgotten is that the evidence is that at least part of the discussion was conducted by reference to a copy of Richard Butler's report. History, I'm afraid, does not relate which of his reports they had before them. But even a cursory glance at his narrative report of 2000 would reveal references to Drago Nikolic and the office he held at page 19, his replacement by Major Galich at the EKM on the 13th of July, page 98, and the taking of 23 prisoners by the Zvornik Brigade on the 22nd of July, page 83. Galice's note, as we pointed out in examination of the accused, is notably more accurate where there is a text for her to refer to. In any event, some accuracy in the note doesn't prove its entire accuracy, and the defence stands by its position that as a record it is incapable of effectively contradicting Pandurović's evidence about the important events of 1995. Lastly, nothing personal was in fact intended. It is the use of the record as a means of contradicting direct evidence which we criticise, not Miss Galice. However, describing her as professional in the circumstances of this interview, we submit, is a bridge too far. On the evidence, she broke many rules in the conduct of this interview, and apart from anything else, this is one of those curious areas where there is direct evidence in this case on the topic. You might remember I asked Dean Manning what he thought about conducting interviews while everybody was drinking alcohol. And he said at T19150 that that would be thoroughly bad practice. The prosecution asserts in its final brief, without any evidential basis whatsoever, that the words terrena and territoria are entirely different phrases. The evidence is at T31001 and T32640 quite to the contrary, that these two words are synonymous. However, one thing we can agree on, searching the terrain and obezbeđenje terena are self-evidently different things. Even the prosecution would agree with that. So the submission in paragraph 1447 that Pandurović had already referred to obezbeđenje terena in paragraphs 1 to 3 of the report is palpably wrong, even on their own interpretation of these phrases. I'd just briefly like to revisit the let them go issue. And really make this submission. The idea that Pandurović could have let the prisoners of war go and chose not to do so, on the evidence you have heard, is ridiculous. Firstly, for a start, by the time he got back to Zvornik, most of them were dead. Secondly, he didn't know where they were. Thirdly, these prisoners were being held under the orders of General Mladić, the VRS Commander-in-Chief, who himself had been president on the ground on the 14th of July and had dedicated his chief of security to the whole operation. Fourthly, all levels of the army were involved, multiple units from the main staff, the corps and other brigades, also private companies and municipal organs. The prosecution agree with this picture of events. It is fanciful to suggest that a 35-year-old red-headed youngster could have gone to any of these killing sites, even if he had known where they were, and could have got there in time and simply let the prisoners go. I'm going to leave the topic of the report because I'm running out of time rapidly. But I do say that there's no compromise on this. The report of the 15th of July is a difficult document to interpret. The prosecution acknowledge it's a difficult document to interpret. Richard Butler has gone through the whole spectrum of interpretations of this document, and I know that you find it difficult to interpret. Everybody has been troubled by this, but unless you can be satisfied that all the adverse inferences that the prosecution wish you to draw are the only interpretations of this document, you have to resolve it in favour of the accused. There's no ducking the issue. If they are not inferences which you think are the only inferences you can draw and the only interpretations of this document, then it becomes wholly exculpatory of Vinko Pandurović. And we submit that when you do look at all the surrounding evidence, what he could have known, what he could have done, that is the only choice faithful to the burden of proof you will apply that you can come to. Now, I'm going to leave that and move on to the question of command of the killing operation. And I'd like really to highlight for you what I submit is a symbolic and important paragraph in the prosecution's brief, and it's paragraph 1468. And I'm not going to dwell on it to any great degree. Why it is symbolic and significant is that that is the first time, chronologically, in the whole history of events where you will find any allegation in the prosecution's brief that Pandurović had effective control of any units or elements of the Zvornik Brigade. symbolically again, we say that when you analyse Mr. McCloskey's closing remarks the other day, he talked about General Pandurović assuming responsibility when he returned on the 15th of July. Now, if you read it as a piece, it will be plain to you that despite the absence of detailed submissions, the prosecution do not concede the question of de jure command. They contend that during this period, Pandurović remained de jure command in the absence of a formal replacement, and you'll find that at paragraphs 1618 to 1625. So the concession must be taken, we assume, to be to the effect that Pandurović was not a de facto commander of the Zvornik Brigade from the 4th to the 15th of July, and you may think that's a perfectly reasonable concession on the evidence. This, we submit, marks a volte-face from the position the prosecution took at the start of the case. They have specifically, we say, abandoned the following positions. One, that Pandurović returned to the Zvornik Brigade command on the morning of the 12th of July and had a conversation with Dragan Obrenović. You'll remember that well. Two, that he had any meaningful contact between, that he had any meaningful contact with Zvornik Brigade command between the 4th and the 15th of July. And three, that he commanded the units prior to his return. If that is right, and we submit you're driven to that conclusion from the absence of any arguments to the contrary in the prosecution brief, as well as the evidence, then two things must follow. Firstly, that he can have had little or no knowledge of the precise deployment of elements of the Zvornik Brigade when he did return. And secondly, that there was no need for him to know anything of the murder operation in Zvornik on the 13th or 14th of July for sure, because he could have no effect upon it. We acknowledge, as is alleged in paragraphs 1469 to 71, that a diminishing number of members of the Zvornik Brigade, in the words of the prosecution, continued to be involved after Pandurović's return. But there is no evidence that Pandurović had any contemporaneous knowledge of that. Put rhetorically, if Obrenović didn't know, which appears to be the case, how could Pandurović have known? The prosecution chants the mantra must have known and needed to know. But we invite you to consider what were the means of Pandurović's knowledge during these critical hours. There is no evidence in the case that any of the people who might have been able to give him information actually did give him information, and that he knew that the elements of the Zvornik Brigade that were involved we now know about. We reiterated the point again that by the 15th of July we're talking about 15 to 20 soldiers. Look at paragraph 1469. Or expressed another way, less than 0.4% of the brigade's manpower. That's roughly the equivalent of saying that Mr. Hocking has to know and needs to know what one intern who's here for 2 weeks is doing on any particular day. The focus of this trial has obviously been on the Zvornik Brigade, since its commander is on trial here. However, one has to place into context that a relatively small number of local conscripts listed as Zvornik Brigade members chose to act as security upon discovering that large numbers of enemy soldiers were being detained in schools close to their homes, and that a few local drivers operated machines rather than leave bodies to decompose. Prisoners were taken to Zvornik, guarded on buses, put in schools, without the help of the Zvornik Brigade. Their execution was carried out by military policemen from the Drina Corps and the Bretonats Brigade, soldiers from the 10th Sabotage Detachment, and other unidentified and unidentifiable units. Also, civil authorities took part, and machineries from private companies were being used. Against this backdrop, the sort of involvement you have heard from those few battalion soldiers is peripheral. I'm going to move on now to the drive past Rahavats on the 17th of July, paragraph 1485. The title to this section of the prosecution brief in our submission should be struck out. There's no evidential basis for suggesting that Pandurović and Obrenović drove past Rahavats in the afternoon of the 17th.
Mr. Haynes, I hate to interrupt you, but we've done this with every other defense counsel. You have gone beyond the 2.5 hours that we had fixed or established. How much longer do you think you need?
I thought I'd had 1 hour and 20 at the first break. So that means I've done what?
You've passed the 2 hours.
Okay. Can I have 20 more minutes?
Okay. Okay.
And can I have a second request?
Yes.
Can I have a break now, and that'll make the next 20 minutes more cohesive, I think.
Okay. Okay. Fine. We'll have a break of 25 minutes.
All rise. Put your vote.
I thought I hadn't. Oh, I thought you told me I was over my time.